On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it was a series of human errors that led to the loss of the New Zealand ship Manawanui off the coast of Samoa. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So we had a presentation done by the Chief of Navy for the Royal New Zealand Defence Force, Rear Admiral Garen Golding, along with the Defence Minister Judith Collins, discussing the events leading to the loss of HMNZS Manawanui, a research vessel that was conducting a survey off the south coast of Samoa. We're going to talk about that and go into some more detail than was given in the briefing, specifically how this vessel was controlled. It is a very unique vessel, and talking about autopilots on and off was very, I would say, cavalier. They needed to go in some more detail about the specifics, and we're going to do that today. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Let's go over to the news conference held by Admiral Golding on the interim report's findings.
The direct cause of the grounding has been determined as a series of human errors, which meant the ship's autopilot was not disengaged when it should have been. The crew was not aware that Manawanui remained in autopilot, and as a consequence, mistakenly assessed the ship's failure to respond to directional changes to the thruster controls as a thruster control failure. Having mistakenly assessed a thruster control failure, standard procedures should have prompted the ship's crew to check that the ship was in manual control rather than autopilot. This check did not occur. Remaining in autopilot resulted in the ship maintaining a course of 340 degrees towards land until grounding and eventually stranding.
So I'll have that full statement, the 30-minute press conference for you in the show notes below. You can listen to the whole thing, but I want to break it down because I felt like even the questions didn't go enough to explain what happened, because he's talking about the ship being in autopilot and basically driving itself up on the reef. However, what he doesn't really talk about is the unique thing about Manawanui. It is much different than a standard naval vessel. So this is Manawanui here. This is a ship that was designed as a commercial vessel. You had basically a pilot officer, a helmsman, along with the survey crew. The ship's captain was not up on the bridge probably during this time, although the ship's captain is ultimately responsible, and we're going to come back to that. Here is Manawanui up on the reef at the time, showing its listing condition. This is Manawanui after the ship had been abandoned. Fire broke out on board. The ship's engine crew had been able to maintain power on board the vessel. That was key for allowing them to get messages off and to assist in the abandoning ship. This is the ship on fire on the reef, and then finally what we see is fire will eventually engulf the vessel, and it sinks off the coast of Samoa, and it is leaking diesel fuel out. Now, the ship had previously been a civilian survey ship, the Edda Fonn, and that's going to be key. It worked in the Norwegian oil and gas industry, but the ship was purchased by the Royal New Zealand Navy in 2018, commissioned on June 7th, 2019, and it was replacing two vessels, a hydrographic survey ship, which is what it was doing in this case, the HMNZS Resolution, and also a diving support ship, its namesake, Manawanui. Now, it entered service in early 2020. It was delayed coming into service because of issues with COVID and a couple other issues I'm going to talk about, which is really key for the events that took place here. Ship has been involved in multiple operations throughout the Pacific, and as I mentioned to you before, it was involved in a survey operation off the southern coast of Samoa when this all unfolded. So I'm going to be referencing the press conference that was held by Admiral Golding along with Defense Minister Collins, along with the official report, or at least the news brief on the report. We haven't seen the official report come out on the events that transpired. So let's go through the kind of timeline here of the events as we saw it. So number one, 5 October 2024, Manawanui was conducting survey operations on the southern side of Apia, Samoa, in a strong breeze up to 25 knots and moderate swell. They had been doing this for 22 hours. So the survey was conducted in a box-shaped area running east to west in survey lanes that start on the outside working inward. So this was a chart that was released by the committee. It was shown during the news conference. Is the track line that Manawanui was on. This is the final track line that shows you the vessel heading eastward off the reef. It makes a turn to the right, comes back along westward, and then it makes a course that 340 degrees heading he talked about, and it heads up here until it finally grounds on the reef and then sinks right here. Now, one of the things that you would want to do in a surveying operation is have a fine a course line as possible. That means you don't want to be meandering. If you have human steering vessels without a fixed point to navigate on, a place to see, you tend to chase the compass. You get a kind of a wiggle in your course line. This is why you shift to autopilot. During a survey operation, absolutely 100% routine to be on autopilot, even close into a reef, to have this done. It is not unusual in any way. At about 6:15 p.m., the ship's crew attempted a routine turn to starboard to right, initially to a course of 340 degrees within the survey area as part of a turn. The crew attempted to turn off the 340-degree course to starboard towards an easterly course, but the ship did not respond as intended. All right, let's go back to this chart for a second. When the ship was doing its west to east run, it makes the turn outbound here to head on an east to west run. According to Admiral Golding, the ship's crew went off autopilot and did this manual turn. They then proceeded east toward west, and then they made the turn to 340 degrees. And the reason they were going to 340 degrees was to get inside this area here to do more surveying. But when they tried to turn off this course, they could not because the autopilot was engaged. All right, it's at this point I wish they would have done it, and they should have done it. They needed to discuss the fact that this ship was a commercial vessel before it became a naval vessel. It does not operate the same way as a naval vessel. If you were thinking that this ship has a wheel and a rudder and you just spin the wheel and you turn the ship, that is wrong. This is not the way this vessel works. This ship worked in the oil and gas industry for Norway. It had, when it was operational, a dynamic positioning system that allowed it to maintain its position accurately. It had a very sophisticated autopilot system engaged on it, but most importantly of all, it does not have a rudder. This ship has a system referred to as Azipods. And let's talk a little bit about these unique systems. So this comes from a description of the vessel that was done. And one of the things you see right here is the unique nature of the ship. Number one, it has a moon pool and a mini moon pool on board. Really cool that it has that. It talks about its main propulsion is by diesel electric. 4 1820 kilowatt diesel power generator sets. It has 2 AC synchronous water-cooled motors, each rated at 2200 kilowatts. The vessel is equipped with 2 diesel electric driven steer prop ST-35 azimuth propellers. The propellers have a diameter of 3 meters. There are also 2 electrically driven tunnel thrusters located in the bow, and in addition there's a super silent type and a retractable thruster with an output of 1350 kilowatts. The key thing here are the Azipods. I could not find a picture of Manawanui's Azipods, so I just pulled this up, but these are typical Azipods. What Azipods do is they hang below the stern of the ship, and one of the things that you'll notice here, they're enclosed electrical motors. The motors are within the Azipods, and the Azipods spin 360 degrees. There is no rudder. The way you steer this ship is by turning the Azipods. Also notice that the propellers are fixed propellers. They're not variable pitch propellers. So the blades do not turn their angle. They spin forward. They're designed to basically be forward running propellers. And the way you maneuver this vessel is through the Azipod system. This was an image provided in the briefing. It's not great. I don't know why they gave us a night vision here of it, but they highlight a couple of things on the ship. Number one, here's the autopilot system, and then here is thruster 4. That is the aft port Azipod, and thruster 5 is the aft starboard Azipods. The other thrusters would have been for the 2 bow thrusters and then for the retractable thruster. Those would have been thrusters 1, 2, and 3. You actually sit in seats between these consoles. This is an image I pulled from Wikipedia of the U.S. ambassador on board Manawanui when the ship was being brought online. You see him sitting there kind of in the command seat. Not unusual at all in ships like this to be in a seated position and control the vessel. This is her in her commercial livery, and one of the things you will notice here is you'll see an image here showing the Azipod back here. This is a warning, so if ships come alongside. And then up forward here, you'll see the thrusters for the bow thrusters and the submersible thruster the retractable thruster that comes out. I couldn't find the specific Azipod system off of Manawanui, but this is one off a cruise ship. So a couple of things to note right here, left and right. This is the left Azipod, this is the right Azipod. And you'll notice that they spin 360 degrees. You can see the outline of the propeller here, the way it's facing, and then the handle here is the throttle. And so you can turn these Azipods any way you want. This is really for fine maneuvering. Typically, the way you would steer the ship when it's at sea is you would lock these systems in place and then use this small wheel here to turn the Azipod. And you do it together. And this would give you, this is basically your wheel of the ship. This is it, just a knob. It allows you to turn the vessel. And then here is your throttle. You can control your speed forward or reverse in this way. You would have to put the ship into different modes and settings. Either you lock the Azipods together and control them through the combined throttle and steering, or you do it independently, moving it, or as is typically done in many cases, you do it through the Autopilot system, which allows you to turn. If you're interested in really the specifics in how to maneuver an Azipod, I have this link in the show notes. It's a great explanation, series of explanations in how to use Azipods in maneuvering. So when we look at this statement that came out from Admiral Golding, the ship turned to a course of 340 degrees. The question is, and it wasn't answered in the briefing, did they do that on an autopilot setting, or did they take the ship off autopilot to make the turn? Now remember, the previous turn they made, they had done manually when they came from an easterly course over to the westerly course. They had done that manually, and then they put back onto autopilot. That's what he says in the briefing. And it appears they did. They were on autopilot. They tried to turn easterly, and they could not do so. Obviously, they tried to use either the manual steering, either the knob or through the thrusters to turn, and they got no response. They maintained themselves on a course of 340 degrees. The problem is this is a very short period of time to make your turn. If they had turned to 340, I can't understand why they would go off manual back onto autopilot for a very small turn, because they were going to come back eastward here. It didn't make a lot of sense, and it's unanswered so far in the statements. Then there's this statement: shortly after Manawanui left the approved survey area in an effort to stop the ship, the crew conducted further actions that they believe should have resulted in the ship essentially breaking. So Azipods do not back down. You don't throw them into reverse. That's not the way they work. There's a couple of things you can do. You can take your Azipods and what's called tow in. So tow in on Azipods is almost like snow plowing with skis. Going down a mountain, you point your skis inward and you basically slow down. You don't come to a complete stop, but it does slow you down. That's what you use Azipods for. You turn them in about 30 degrees, even more if you have to, 60 degrees, 90 degrees, you're actually creating just turbulence and you're stopping. Understand, you can back down Azipods, you can put them into reverse, in other words, spin the props reverse. When you do that, you create cavitation, you basically boil the water around the propeller, you create air pockets. It is very inefficient. It's not a very efficient way to stop the vessel. What struck me most about this was the indication that they sped up. They went from 6 knots up to 10 knots. What that tells me is that they were trying to stop the vessel. One of the ways you can stop a ship with Azipods almost immediately is turn the Azipods 180 degrees, throw the throttles down, and you're putting your thrust forward. In other words, you're slamming on the brakes. And I wonder if they did that. I wonder if they thought that they were putting the Azipods in reverse. They spun them 180 degrees manually on the controllers, put the throttles down, and that would have stopped them. What seems to have happened is that the Azipod controllers were not in local mode. In other words, they couldn't control the Azipods, but the throttles still were. And when they hit the throttle forward, you got more spin out of the props, and that propelled them faster to the reef. They hit that reef at 10 knots instead of 6 knots. And this is a question about the training of the crew, how proficient the crew was in the use of the Azipods, and were they able to take this ship out of autopilot. It almost appears as if the ship was in a modified form of Azipod operation where the Azipods were locked forward. They did not have helm control of the Azipods, but they did have thruster control. They had throttle control. And what we see is that transpired. And that goes back to crew training, familiarization with the system, and how to get this system out. Again, they don't have a lot of time between the time they made that turn to 340 degrees and they're heading straight for the reef. So this happened about 6:17 p.m. So you're talking about post-dinner. Crew is probably in their quarters, hanging out. You had probably the minimal bridge watch up along with a survey team as they were conducting the last of their survey when this event happened. Not clear whether or not the crew on the bridge called the ship's captain up to the bridge or if the ship's captain was on the bridge during the grounding. Again, we did not get specifics regarding this. I know there's a lot of controversy about this ship's captain, whether or not she was qualified for this. Again, she was a former Royal Navy officer, 30 years in naval service. A lot of issues that fly around about it. The question I have is not so much the ship's captain, but who was in charge up on the bridge at that moment. So Admiral Golding made a point during the briefing to say that there were a series of contributing issues that caused this to happen. I want to read the 5 of them to you. Training, planning, supervision, readiness, and risk assessment. That is pretty damning, I have to say. If those were the issues across the board there, that is not good for this ship's captain. All right, let's keep going here with our timeline of events. So full control of Manawanui's propulsion plant was not regained until 10 minutes later. That is a big problem. Why did it take them 10 minutes to realize that they were in autopilot and they could not get out of the autopilot setting? Again, when they tried to turn, they thought the failure was of the thruster system. They thought that the Azipod had basically malfunctioned. What they didn't realize is they had locked themselves into autopilot. Goes on here. Did not regain until 10 minutes later at 6:27 when the ship's autopilot was disengaged. The inability to turn the ship to an easterly direction from the 340-degree course and stop the ship is attributed to the ship being in autopilot mode. So one of the things about this ship, it was a commercial ship. It was the Edda out of Norway. I have heard repeatedly from sources that New Zealand did not pay the full amount of money in the conversion to get that dynamic positioning system installed in it. This track line could have been put into a system and the ship would have automatically run the track. It would have just, mowed the grass. It would have done the entire track line without a problem. That did not appear to happen. I think there's a big issue here on whether or not the autopilot system on this vessel was 100%. Now, notice the way this vessel is. She's leaning to starboard. She's heeled over. That means her bow is aground. Her Azipods are probably hit and damaged, can't turn. You're not going to be able to pull this vessel off. Now, unsuccessful attempts were made to maneuver the ship off the reef. Very unlikely that's going to happen. The ship is heeling to starboard. You see that the thrusters would not be usable in this situation. The Azipods aren't usable. To be clear about thrusters, too, thrusters only work when you're going under a speed of about 3 knots. So those thrusters would not, the bow thrusters would not be an option here to pull you off course, especially as the ship was speeding up. Manawanui was brought to an emergency stations after the grounding and searches were conducted to check for damage. So obviously one of the first things you're going to do is ensure that the ship is not flooding, make sure you have watertight integrity, get a crew count, make sure everybody's accounted for, no one was hurt. When you hit the reef, the ship's going to stop. You could have crew members who are hurt in that moment. No damage or flooding was detected inside the ship. However, stability assessments made after the grounding indicated Manawanui was no longer stable. Ships are designed to float. They're not designed to be touching bottom. When ships touch bottoms, they get lifted up, they get tilted, and the center of gravity and buoyancy all begin to go out of whack. And what you can have is a catastrophic rolling of the vessel. The fear is the ship rolls on you, because everything is out of whack on the ship. And so their decision was made to basically begin the process of abandoning ship. So at 6:46, about 30 minutes after the initial grounding, the decision was made to abandon ship. Seems quick, but when you're talking about having a survey crew on board who's probably not as, they're not Royal New Zealand Navy personnel, they're basically civilians on board, you want to get them off the ship and make sure that you are being safe with them. The timelines of the decision to abandon ship and to keep Manawanui's generators running contributed to the successful abandonment process and likely prevented serious injuries or death. There is one thing to abandon ship in daylight, it's a whole other thing to do it in dark, especially with a ship at an angle. Lights on board are key. If you can see what you're doing, it is much, much safer. Plus, they're sending out their SOS. We know this because ships came to the area very quickly to help save Manawanui. We know vessels arrived. There was a Royal Navy vessel, a OPV in the area, and actually the Queen Elizabeth, the Cunard cruise liner, showed up in the area, along with local craft that came in to save this crew. Finally, the ship suffered a series of catastrophic fires after being abandoned before capsizing and sinking on the morning of Sunday, 6 October. The ship remains off the coast of Samoa underwater. You can see its outline there, and you can see a small stream of oil coming out of the vessel. Process is underway to remove the fuel and potentially raise the vessel to clear it off the reef. While I think Admiral Golding and Minister Collins answered some questions, I still have many more regarding this incident, particularly the use and operation of the dynamic positioning system, the thruster control on board the vessel, the experience that the pilot had on the ship in using that system. Were they very conversant in how to shift between autopilot and off autopilot? Why were they not using autopilot to make the turns? Again, you can just program in your turns and the ship will do it automatically and make the turn for you. Why was it they just didn't take thrust off the vessel to stop the ship from advancing forward? Did they not understand they can just pop it into a manual control and do it? The thrusters appeared to be working. I mean, if you were still going ahead, that's a thruster issue. You can take the power off the thruster, basically stop the propeller from turning. And that would have aided. And even if you lose one thruster, these are independent thrusters. They're separate Azipods. They are self-contained motors. If one goes bad, turn it off and use the other one. And worst comes to worst, one's pointed forward, one's pointed back. You're just spinning circles in the ocean. It's going to be a wild ride, but you can do it. But the 5 points that Admiral Golding made, training, how well trained was this crew in the operation of the vessel, especially in close proximity to a reef. Now, survey vessels will operate in close proximity to reefs all the time. It's also interesting that they were using the vessel for this survey. They weren't using some autonomous systems, but again, the Royal New Zealand Navy does not have a lot of assets. It has to make do with what it has, so it was doing that. Planning. What was the planning operation? Why was the route not meticulously planned out so they knew exactly where they were? For example, why turn toward the reef, not away from the reef, come back around onto a course? Do yourself a kind of a Williamson turn. Instead of putting yourself straight toward the reef, turn away from the reef, make your turn back in and make a gradual approach into the reef. Supervision. Who should have been up on the bridge? Maneuvering in tight situations, close to dangerous. That should have maybe required this commanding officer, the executive officer, someone with experience. Again, we don't know who was on the bridge. They may have been up there, may not have been. But that's a question that I have. Readiness, how ready was this vessel? It seems as if, for example, the abandoned ship was very well handled. They got 75 people off. There was no injury, no major injuries on the vessel. They were able to get everybody off. And then risk assessment. You know, one of the things you do when you undertake survey operations is determine the risk assessment. At what point is this operation the most risky? They've been doing it for 22 hours. Impossible for a ship's master or captain be on the bridge for 22 hours. But the question becomes, how do you mitigate the risk assessment, especially when you're getting close to the end of an event? That tends to be where accidents happen, either very beginning or very end. That tends to be where we see accidents happen. And in this case, it led to the catastrophic loss of the vessel. Fortunately, no lives were lost, but again, it's having a massive impact in Samoa with fishing grounds being contaminated. Obviously, the Royal New Zealand Navy lost its 3rd largest ship in the fleet, a huge loss for the Royal New Zealand Defense Force here. And how they go about getting a replacement is going to be really tough in the budget they're operating under. This is a major impact. So I hope I broke that down in a way that's a little bit more detailed than what the Royal New Zealand Defense Force did. If you enjoyed today's episode, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You can hit the super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly or yearly subscriber. Big news, of course, is we are on Spotify now. We are turning our videos into podcasts. So if you want the dulcet tones of Sal Mercogliano talking about shipping, you can download it to your whatever media device you use and get the podcast. Until next episode, this is Sal signing off.